go ahead and get daily Bible readers. While we're standing in the back, to raise your hand. We'll take care of that. All right. As we get started here, we'll go ahead and have a word of prayer to get the class started. And Don, would you mind doing that for us? I believe lesson 2 we take from Numbers chapter 11, so if you want to be turning in your quarterly book and or your Bible, we won't just sit and park in Numbers. We'll flip around a little bit, so if you have your Bible with you, you may want to have that handy. We've got extra quarterly, so if you don't have one or you'd like to have one, if you raise your hand, Barry's coming down and we'll provide you with one. I am obviously not Eric. He is teaching the 6th or 8th graders downstairs this quarter, and I made a deal with him. If he'd teach them, I would teach his 3 classes up here. I think I got the better end of that deal. 3 for 13 is pretty good, but I'm going to cover for Eric's 3 weeks up here this quarter, and then he'll be back up with you in the rotation in the winter quarter. With that, though, I have been downstairs, so I wasn't up here. I think Johnny started the class last week, so I'm not exactly sure what he covered that might have been outside of what was in the quarterly, and so I'm going to try to stick pretty close to what's covered in the lesson, though take a couple tangents as they come. But the actual passage for this lesson is Numbers chapter 11, verses 16 through 25, and we'll read through that here in a minute. But before we do, I guess I want to make application right at the outset. A lot of this has to deal with Moses, and quite a bit of the early books of the Old Testament deal with Moses and his leadership of the Lord's people as they come out of Egypt and as they wander and try to enter the Promised Land. I find Moses to be a very interesting character. For a lot of the lessons that we can learn from Moses that maybe we overlook along the way. We focus on Moses in a lot of areas that are worthy to focus on, but we focus on them in maybe a mindset to Bible classes and children's studies, because we focus on those, the beginning of Moses' life and the basket, and we focus on him as parting the Red Sea and things that are interesting stories and easy lessons to teach in children's classes, and that very worthy lessons to teach. But I think there's a lot of interesting points about Moses that we can take that maybe we don't look at a lot, and some of those is what I want to make application to right at the outset that feeds into the couple of lessons we learn within this week's material. What do we know about Moses and his dedication? How did Moses start out as a leader? What? Okay, meek. That's putting it nicely. He didn't want to do it at first. He spent quite a bit of Exodus chapter 4 coming up with reasons not to do it and not to go. But I think something that we do take from Moses is, even though he spent a lot of time trying to turn down the role as leader, and we'll look at it in a minute. But he spent a lot of time trying to say, for whatever I can't. I'm not good enough. I can't do it. They won't listen to me. For all these reasons, once God finally got upset with him and said, "Okay, take your brother with you," and Moses went and he assumed the role as leader. As much as he seemed like he didn't want to do it, once he stepped into that role, he dove right in. I mean, he went in head first, completely absorbed himself in that role, to the point where in a couple of sections he went too far. Once he accepted it, he gave it his all. Like we were mentioning, Exodus chapter 3, God comes to Moses and basically says, "You're going to go to Egypt, you're going to carry my people out." And then Moses spends verses, I think, 1 through 18 of chapter 4, talking about why he can't, whether it was because he was ineloquent, whether it's because they wouldn't listen to him, so on and so forth. But then he accepted it, and then he went. And after he comes out, brings them out of Egypt, after some time, we find him in Exodus chapter 18 in a discussion with Jethro, his father-in-law. And what happens there? What does Jethro have to tell him? What was Moses doing? He was taking it all on himself. He was acting as essentially judge to all of the even trivial matters among the people. And what did Jethro have to tell him? To distribute the responsibility. Basically, you're going to burn yourself out. You can't be the judge over everything that happens. The trivial matters don't need to be your responsibility. Only the and I'm obviously paraphrasing and lack of better term, only the big things need to come to you. Otherwise, you're not going to survive. You're going to wear out. I also find it interesting, another tangent, and we're never going to get to the lesson. Another, I like Jethro. You know, we only read about Jethro in Exodus 4 and Exodus 18. And we see where Jethro, in chapter 4, Moses is basically tending to Jethro's herd, his animals. And this is after God's finally could convince Moses to do it. And he goes to Jethro and says, well, we flip over. I don't want to butcher the verse. Exodus chapter 4 and verse 18. So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. He didn't put up an argument. He was supportive. We see it, and we turn again to chapter 18, where Jethro comes to Moses and basically gives him this great advice. Even though Moses is the leader of this people, he still needs the advice of his elders, of the people who are older than him, the people who have experience in these things, and this is his father-in-law. And you think back to Moses' raising. He didn't, because he was taken in by Pharaoh's daughter and raised, there's an argument to be made that he wasn't really connected to his natural parents. Now, obviously, his birth mother was able to nurse him, and we don't have a lot of consideration about how his father was involved and in a lot of ways, because we move right on into his leadership. But what we do know is that his father-in-law took on a nurturing role in his life. And those of us who have good in-laws and good father-in-laws and mother-in-laws, we understand how important that added set of parents is. And what we see here is a relationship between Jethro and Moses where he accepted the advice of his father-in-law. And it was good advice. So in chapter 18, Jethro says, you can't do it all on your own. You got to let it go. You've got to distribute the responsibility. To make an application of that as Christians, we can overwork ourselves in the church. And we see that again here in chapter 11 with the 70 elders. Starting in verse 16. So the Lord said to Moses, gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, that they may stand there with you. Then I will come down and talk with you there. I will take of the Spirit that is upon you, and will put the same upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, but you may not bear it yourself alone. As we work in the church, we can take on more than we can handle. We can take on more responsibility than we need to. Now, we've got to step back and say we can't let that be an excuse to not take on anything. But it is easy for good-intentioned people to take on so much that they can't do anything that they take on well, and they burn out, and we lose somebody who was at one time willing to work hard, but they burn themselves out. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, we're taught that that it's a mention of sin, and God's not going to put anything in front of us that we can't escape of. But I think the same application can be made to pressures and burdens and things like this. Anything that stands in our way of working for the church and working for the Lord, there's a way out. And I don't mean a way out as in, to get out of the responsibility, but there's a way out of burnout. There's a way out of being overcome. Sometimes it's asking for help. Numbers chapter, just before we get into our section, verse 14. I got to turn over to Numbers. I haven't done that yet. Numbers 11, verse 14, we see Moses accepting the fact that he can't do it all. Verse 14, I am not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. In a way, I want to imagine that was hard for Moses to say. Because we already know that Moses has a propensity of taking on more than he can do. We already talked about Jethro have to come to him and say, you can't do it all. And here again, Moses has to come to the realization, I can't do it all. I need help. So even though we want to try to work in the church, and we need to try to work in the church, we have to accept that sometimes we reach our limits. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 12 talks about the principles of giving. And it basically says that that God's not going to ask of us more than what we have. God's not going to lay a burden on us that we can't do. And I think the same principle applies not just in giving financially, but giving of ourselves in the work of the church. He's not going to expect of us more than we're capable of giving. But you better believe he's going to expect of us what we're capable of giving. If we're capable of doing something, we simply choose not to do it, then that's going to be on us. But Matthew 25, 14 through 30 talks about the parable of talents. And I think there's two lessons that come out of the parable of talents. One is that we better use the talents that we have. Whether it was 1, 3, 5. it was clear that the ones that used the talents were rewarded. The ones that didn't was not. And so we've got to use the talents that we're given. If we don't, we'll have to face those consequences. But I think the second lesson that may be overlooked a little bit is that we don't all have the same abilities. And we can't expect everyone in the church to be able to do everything. Some of us are more willing to do X, Y, and Z and more able to do X, Y, and Z, and others can't do X, Y, and Z but can do A, B, and C. And I'm being very general because I don't want to get into specifics, but I think that's a lesson we have to learn. And sometimes we find ourselves comparing Christians to one another. And you've got to be able to go out and do this, or you're not being a good Christian. Well, maybe that person just doesn't have those talents. Now, we can't ignore the talents we do have. And lastly, when good-intentioned people who have become overburdened ask for help, the rest of us have to be willing to give the help. We can't sit back and let 10% of the congregation do all the work. That's not the way God intended it. We all have talents. We all have abilities. And sometimes we have to make sure everyone's using those abilities and not get overburdened. So, back to the lesson. Now that I have a good 10 minutes to do the whole lesson. Moses says, I can't do it all. And so God's response is, go select 70 elders. In a way, it seems like an expansion of Jethro's suggestion with the judges, people to judge over those in Israel. And I think what we see is, and the quarterly talks about this, the fact that single leaders often breeds discontentment. When there's one person in charge, for some reason, it breeds more discontentment. Maybe because everybody can lay all the blame on one person. And you can see here, we go on in a few minutes and talk about meat being sent to or provided for the people. Talks about there being 600,000 people that Moses is ruling over. So he's got 600,000 people who he's in charge of, and all their problems are coming to him. And so it's easy to see how he's gotten overburdened. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And once again, you use the abilities that those under him have. I think it's interesting to note, if you look in history, and former history teacher, I guess, as the nation was forming, there was a lot of contention among the founding fathers about there being a president, because they hearkened it back to the king. And the fact they wanted to get away from a king. And there were a number of the founding fathers who did not want a president because they were afraid it was going to become another king. And I can't remember which one it was, but one of the founding fathers had the suggestion, and it may have been more than one, but had the suggestion of there being a 3-person executive council instead of one president. Their suggestion was we should have the executive office vested in a 3-person committee. So imagine how the government would be with 3 presidents instead of one. But that was the reason why they, one person with a lot of power can sow discontentment, whether they mean to or not. It's not necessarily a reflection of Moses or any other good-intentioned leader. It's just the way people are. And so we see that in what Jethro had to come and say. You can't do it We see it here in Numbers 11. Moses says, I can't do it all. I think there's also a good correlation that can be made in the New Testament. How is the New Testament church supposed to be organized? A plurality of elders. Not one elder, not one preacher running the congregation, but a plurality of elders. So the 70 Moses says, I can't do it all. And God says, go pick 70 of the elders. And in verse 17 of Numbers 11 that we just read, he said that God said that he would take the spirit that is on Moses and distribute it to these 70 elders, so that they can bear the burden of the people, and Moses won't have to bear it alone. So Moses is given some relief by these elders. So that's the first lesson that comes out of today's passage of Scripture. The second lesson comes in verses, I think, 18 through 20. So let's look at 11, verses 18 through 20. Then you shall say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, and you will have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat, not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have despised the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever come up out of Egypt? The nation of Israel turned into a pretty discontented group of people. I think the key lesson that we get out of this section here may be that man has free choice, and there's in a few weeks you're going to talk about Balaam. In Numbers chapter 22, verse 15 through 21, we talk about Balaam and Balak, and you're going to talk about that. So I'm not going to get into it, but in the verses before, there's the conversation about Balaam and Balak, the plains of Moab, and Balak wanting Balaam to come and be a prophet and basically strike down the people of Israel. Obviously, God's not going to let him do that. But if you flip over to chapter 22. And in verse 10, so Balaam said to God, Balak the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, Look, a people has come out of Egypt, and they cover the face of the earth. Come now, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to overpower them and drive them out. And God said to Balaam, You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. So God says, no, you're not going to do this. You're not going to go with Balak. You're not going to go and curse the people of Israel. They're my people. But then Balaam keeps pushing. And if you flip over to 18, or come down to verse 18, then Balaam answered and said to hold on, sorry. Wrong one. Verse 20. And God came to Balaam at night and said to him, If the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you that you shall do. And you'll get into the rest of the story of Balaam later. But the key here is Balaam kept at it. And finally God said, fine, if you want to go, go. You need to only say what I tell you to say. But if you just insist on going, go to Moab. The book has a great quote that I like. It says, Both Balaam and Israel learned the hard way that permission from God does not mean he is pleased with your choice. One of the great message about the Bible is that man has a choice. We can choose to follow God. We can choose to do what God tells us to do, or we can choose not to. God's not going to stand in our way. And just because God's going to let us doesn't mean he agrees with our choice. You think about the divisions of Christendom throughout the years. Is God pleased with instrumental music? Is God pleased with variety of ways of baptism or the lack thereof? No. But he didn't stand in the way of it happening. Because man has free will, a choice. Right. Right. And you're not going to. Yeah. And you're not going to like it, but I'm going to give it to you because that's what you're begging for. Yeah. WA. One of the last points that I have here, and I know the bell's rung. Sometimes people will only learn by mistake. Sometimes people will only learn by sitting. Think about Peter. Jesus said, "You're going to deny me." No, I'm not. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stand right there by you. You're going to deny me. What happened? He denied Christ. He learned from it. He repented of it, and obviously, Peter became a great leader in the church. He was one of the apostles, and it showed forth. But he had to make a mistake, and God allowed him to make it. He allowed him to make those choices. And just like W.A. said, they asked for it, and they got it. And my very last point, God would teach them by making them suffer in abundance. They wanted meat, and God gave them meat. He gave them meat every day for a month until they couldn't stand it anymore. And sometimes we suffer in abundance. And I think that's the last lesson here. Sometimes we suffer in abundance. And sometimes I think we suffer in abundance in America. We have more than we could ever need. But somehow we keep wanting more. And God finds a way to teach us lessons. We just have to look for it. I didn't get through it all, and I knew I wouldn't. Thank you all for listening.